Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Taryn Myers, and I'm not able to be there in person. And so I am pre-recording this video to talk to you about a very exciting study we have examining the relationship between the big five personality traits and things like learning engagement. So the premise for our study was, do certain students do better with virtual or online learning, and why? We were thinking specifically about Chesapeake Bay Academy's unique neurodivergent sample. And we, in particular, were interested in looking at the big five personality traits. Now, if you're not familiar with these, they can be remembered with the simple acronym OCEAN. Openness to experience is creativity, openness to try new things. Conscientiousness is being fastidious, getting their work done, wanting things to be right. Extroversion is what we all think of as extroversion, outgoingness. Agreeableness is wanting to get along with other people. And then neuroticism is an old-fashioned term that basically relates to things like anxiety. We were also interested to see how much engagement might be related. And this was both behavioral and emotional engagement with learning. So our hypotheses for this study were that conscientiousness would be related to engagement. Neuroticism would be associated with a preference for virtual learning, and that neurodivergent students, particularly those with autism spectrum disorder, would prefer virtual learning. There wasn't a lot of background information on this study. Not a lot of other people have looked at this particular question. So we came up with some non-directional research questions. So our first was, what student personality traits correlate with that engagement with learning? Our second was, what personality traits are related to preference for in-class versus virtual learning? And our third was, which of those engagement variables are related to students' preferences for in-class versus virtual learning? So our participants were 46 CBA students. Unfortunately, however, 19 of them didn't complete the questionnaires. And anecdotally, particularly for our middle school students, this was too long and or too confusing. And so this is something, a lesson learned for next study that we conduct. Our final sample consisted of 27 students with a mean age of about 14. They were about 60% male and 45-ish% white. About 60% of these students met criteria for an ADHD diagnosis, and about a quarter met criteria for an ASD, autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, and one had both. Now, we conducted this study online via SurveyMonkey. First, we got parental consent via DocuSign, and then students gave assent within the survey. They answered some demographic questions, a learning preferences questionnaire that included both Likert type items where they can report how much they like certain kinds of learning, as well as forced choice questions about, would you rather learn in person or virtually? We used the engagement versus disaffection with learning questionnaire and the 5-factor model adolescent personality questionnaire. So our results for hypothesis 1 were that conscientiousness was in fact correlated with behavioral, emotional, and total engagement. However, hypothesis 2 was not supported. There was no correlation between neuroticism and preferring virtual learning. Similarly, hypothesis 3 was not supported. There were no difference in preference for virtual learning, whether or not students had an ASD diagnosis, and there was no significant relationship between that diagnosis and that forced choice item for preferring virtual versus in-class learning. We did find some really interesting things with our research questions, however. So agreeableness was significantly related to behavioral and total engagement. Neuroticism was negatively correlated with emotional and total engagement. Extroversion and openness to experience were not related. However, openness to experience and conscientiousness were both positively correlated with preference to learn in class. And then behavioral, emotional engagement, lack of emotional disaffection, and total engagement were all positively correlated with student preferences to learn in person. And then there were significant differences in emotional engagement for students who preferred to learn in person versus virtually. However, this should be taken with a grain of salt because only 3 out of our 27 students preferred to learn virtually. Here is our correlational table. And one thing I just want to point out here is the strength of some of these correlations. So for example, if you look at preference to learn in class with emotional engagement, a correlation of 0.72 is huge. So it really was a strong relationship. In terms of future directions, we're currently collecting comparison data with a university sample, including with students who specifically work with their Office of Disability Services. But we would like to expand this to non-neurodivergent samples of a comparable age in the future. So thank you for listening to the video me, and I very much appreciate your attendance today.